Hey everyone, this is Brian from the Tennis IQ podcast. Josh and I hope that you are enjoying the content and discussions that we put out week after week. If you'd like to support the podcast and help us to continue to produce quality episodes, please visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/tennisiqpodcast/membership. Currently, we have 3 tiers of support: the fan level at $3 per month, the supporter level at $7 per month, and the champion level at $20 per month. Benefits of joining the Tennis IQ podcast community include episode transcripts, participation in book club discussions, and access to monthly masterclasses with me and Josh. For more on these benefits of support, head on over to our Patreon page at patreon.com/tennisiqpodcast/membership. Thank you so much. And now, on to the show. Welcome to the Tennis IQ podcast. I'm Brian Lomax.
And I'm Josh Berger. For today's episode, we are going to start with a quote from Marcus Aurelius, and we can talk just a little bit about him and who he was. And so we'll start with this quote by him, which is, "Never confuse yourself by visions of an entire lifetime at once. Remember that it is not the weight of the future or the past that is pressing upon you, but ever that of the present alone." So I think this is interesting. I think there's a lot of different angles that we can get into with this quote and with this idea, really. But I think first of all, I think it's interesting to talk just a little bit about who Marcus Aurelius was. And he really is one of the main figures in Stoicism and Stoic philosophy. And the book that that is often thought about is a book called Meditations, which really was not ever intended to be a book itself. It was essentially a diary of different passages that he wrote to himself, and he was at the time the Roman emperor, the most powerful person in the world at that time, roughly 2,000 years ago. And essentially, he's writing to himself just different bits of wisdom. And Brian, you actually mentioned this as we were talking beforehand, but which is something I hadn't necessarily thought about. But he's writing it all in second person. He's saying, "You should, you ought to do this, and you should do this," and all of those sorts of things. But I think that's really interesting that he's essentially using the coach's voice. He's essentially giving this wisdom, giving these suggestions to himself, as a person whose, power and influence is essentially unmatched. But as we read it back now, 2,000 years later, it really, I think, more than anything else, really stands the test of time. And I think, a lot of the ideas actually that we talk about and on this podcast, and just, I think really key ideas in sports psychology and beyond as well, things like controlling the controllables, things like understanding your own fatality, and being and living with that in mind, and other important ideas are all based on things that he has said, among other Stoic philosophers as well. So I think there's a lot of so I think when we think about a quote like this for him, and we can absolutely dive into this quote and some of the implications of it, I think it's important as well to think about who he was.
And from a psychology perspective, if you think about rational emotive behavior therapy, which is originally developed by Albert Ellis, a lot of cognitive behavioral therapy, Aaron Beck, much of that is derived from Stoicism, especially Ellis's experiences. He writes a lot about the Stoics in his writing, and if you do any reading into rational emotive behavior therapy, you'll find a lot of references to Stoicism, and it's really the backbone of a lot of that, and which means it's the backbone of a lot of even performance psychology. Hence, why we talk about it a lot. Why I think we use philosophy often as a foundation for psychology and learning how to think about ourselves and what we can do, and using strategies and techniques that will help us deal with the modern world. Even though these thinkers lived, say, some 2000 plus years ago, this wisdom has been around. And, for various reasons, it's not always shared as much as it could be, but I think we're seeing some revival with Stoicism. So Stoicism, I think, is something that everyone should look into at least a little bit. And Meditations, it's not a long book per se. Um, the translations of it can sometimes be difficult. So I think it's really helpful when reading something like that, because it's a primary source, is to also read some other books that help explain Stoicism a little bit more. And I think doing the two of those things can really help. And the reason we're talking about this is a big part of the psychology of being a great competitor in tennis is having better ideas behind how you think. If you have better ideas behind how you think, you can handle adversity better. You can generate more productive emotions for yourself. And so reading some things like this from the great thinkers of history can really help. Stoicism is great. But you can also look at Buddhism, ancient Chinese philosophies, Toltec wisdom, and then more recently, something I really like to use is existentialism, which builds off of all of those ancient philosophies and extends it a little bit more into the modern world. But yeah, I'd love to hear, Josh, your first impressions of what Marcus Aurelius is really getting at with this particular quote.
Yeah, to me, I think there's a couple different things here. To me, he's talking about, the weight of the future, and the past, and that those are, he says that those are sort of pressing upon you. So sorry, he's saying that it's not the weight of those that are sort of pressing on you. It's not the weight of those that are most prominent in any particular moment. It's the weight of the present. So it's that, the present moment needs to be what's focused on, and it's really all that we ever have. And I think trying to stay present is a challenge. Is a challenge for everybody. I think sometimes when somebody starts meditating, for instance, they notice that their thoughts are drifting. They're focused on things that have already happened. Oh, why did I say that thing earlier today? Oh, why did I procrastinated on this and put this off? Now it's still there. Oh, why, or thinking about the future. Oh, what could happen, what might happen. And I think as we start to meditate, we become more aware of that, of those sorts of things. We also start to have a tool, which is our breath, which we can use to try to come back to the present. And I think as athletes, and tennis is a sport where this is certainly true, but as athletes, it's very easy to fall into this trap of spending more and more time in the past and in the future, right? Thinking about the past in terms of maybe wishing things were different. Why is the score the way that it is? Or why did I miss that shot? Or I can't believe my opponent made that line call. Or thinking about the future. Okay, that might be, I'm trying to serve out the set here. I'm so close. I just need to win this game. Or if I win this match, who am I playing next? Or if I lose today, what's this going to do to my UTR? Or what's my coach going to think? Or are other people going to think? So it's very easy to be constantly jumping towards the future or the past, but none of that really helps. None of that helps. To me, it actually reminds me of this idea. I don't know who said this originally, but it was about anxiety and talking about how when we worry or when we're in fear about what could potentially happen, we end up suffering twice. Once in our imagination and then once in reality. So we spend this time suffering, worrying, being sort of lost in thought about the possibility of what could happen. And that's an unpleasant experience. And then there's the moment where it actually potentially does happen, or maybe it doesn't. But yeah, I think to me, it's, rather than spending this time, you know, in the future, in the past, which I think everybody does, you know, can we the present is all that's ever actually there. So can we recognize that that really is where, where we ought to be putting our attention, and at least trying to put as much of our focus as possible on the present. And I think as we think about tennis, tennis is a sport where we get that instant feedback every point. We win it or we lose it. So it's very easy to look backwards and maybe wish that things were different. And so I think, especially in a sport like tennis, having systems and a process to become present, something like a routine between points, something like our breath, even self-talk we can use to help bring us back to the present is really important.
So I 100% endorse what you're saying, Josh, about the present, the importance of that. But since it's normal for us to think about the past and to think about the future, can we almost look at it differently and say, let's look at the past in a new way? Maybe let's look at the future in a new way that will make it easier to transition to thinking about the present. So the future one I think is interesting because I know we had an episode where we talked about optimism and pessimism and the difference, and how pessimism was often a tool to help deal with uncertainty. And I don't know if I told this story when we talked about that episode, but to me, well, I wrote a couple blog posts last fall, like late 2023, about uncertainty and optimism and pessimism. And the first post was about being a sports fan. So, and I was writing this with a story in mind. I remember this is pre-internet, 1990 World Cup. I was a big soccer fan. And at the time I was working in Boston. And, with the time difference, the games were happening during the day. So my kind of modus operandi was I would tape the games on my VCR. And then when I would come home, I would watch.
Where was the tournament?
Oh, in 1990, it was in Italy.
Okay.
So I remember very specifically, Josh, the semifinal game was between Italy and Argentina. I was really excited to watch this game. So that whole day, I'm like, all right, complete media blackout. I don't want to know anything. I don't want to know the score. Because if somebody, let's say, had told me on the train ride home, oh, did you hear Argentina won the game on penalties? It would have ruined the experience. And it actually, so what I'm trying to say here is certainty actually ruined the experience. Knowing what happened ruined it for me. Because now I was like, I don't really need to watch. I don't need to spend 90 or 120 minutes watching this. Maybe I'll watch the penalties part, right? So is uncertainty about like what might happen in a match so bad? Could we look at it as if we're a sports fan where we'd rather not know? Because there's a certain excitement to the journey of not knowing, right? Being open to that possibility. So could we look at the future in that way? Being open to it, being excited about it, seeing it as an adventure. Seeing it also as we have a chance. I could win this match. You mentioned the suffering twice. Very often when we are anticipating problems, the anticipation is worse than actually dealing with it in the moment. Right?
Definitely.
So I think that's one way we could change, kind of like put on a different pair of glasses and look at the future. I think we could do the same for the past. With an understanding that we are always evolving as humans, as players. And nothing that we've done in the past is really condemning us to a specific destiny in our future, right? Every moment of every day, you get a chance to write your future. And if we look at it like a tennis match, if it's, say, 4-all, 30-all in the first set, who knows what could happen? You can project certain things, but you could create a win here if you really stick to it. So when we look at the past, we want to have an understanding. This isn't about having to have been perfect my whole life up until this moment. No, we all make mistakes. We're all evolving. And all of those mistakes and losses and whatever else, they are part of who you have become today. And can we use our experience in the past not as a means of condemning ourselves for not being perfect, but as a means of building more self efficacy of I can do this. I have grown from point A to point B to C. Maybe I've even tackled situations like this in the past, so I know I can do this. And so to me, it's not so much about always being in the present, because I think that's impossible, but it's how can you use your past and how can you use your vision of the future to help you stay focused on what you want to do right now.
So I wanted to go back to a point that you were saying about uncertainty, because I think it's really important. I think that uncertainty can be really intimidating, can be really scary. We don't know what's going to happen. We think about all the different possibilities that could happen and the consequences of those. But I think that we, especially in a sport like tennis, we can embrace uncertainty because just like with your World Cup example, if a tennis player always knew that they were going to win, would it really be that rewarding?
Yeah, that's
Would
an
it?
example of certainty not
Yeah,
being positive.
exactly. Exactly. Okay. So I know I'm going to win today. When it actually happens, is it as exciting? I don't know. I remember, I forget who it was, but I think actually different people have said this, and they'll say, you know what? If you want to be absolutely certain that that you're going to win, you could play against people that are just playing for the first time, or play against really young children
Yeah, red ball.
yeah, and you know what? You're going to win. And if it's all about winning, then set yourself up for that. And you should play people that are just playing for the first time or have never played before, or you know, just play against set the level of challenge as low as possible for yourself. But I think for, certainly for people that are listening to this and for people that are about being the best player that they can be and that want to challenge themselves, it's obviously not about that. Yes, you want to win. Yes, you're a competitor, but it's not all about that. You know that you're going to lose sometimes. You know that the best players in the world lose sometimes. And that's a part of it. That's natural. That's a part of the human experience that you're gonna win and you're gonna lose. But I think it's about, I think there's different things here. Can we embrace that challenge? Can we embrace those situations where, okay, I'm playing this person and they're a really tough competitor, but hey, I'm playing really well and I'm fighting back and we're going back and forth. And can I really embrace that moment and say, look at what I'm doing out there, right? Like, look at me play that way. And I think it's about, instead of being so focused, I think there's two different ways to see that situation, right? You're playing that strong competitor, you're going back and forth. One way of seeing it is maybe being overwhelmed by that uncertainty and being so focused on, am I going to win this match? Am I going to lose this match? What's going to happen? And I'm jumping towards the future, thinking about those possibilities. Another way of thinking about that is, hey, I'm playing this way. This is working. What can I do in this next point? Who's doing what to whom here? What are my opponent's weaknesses that I can really capitalize on? How can I really make sure that I play a great point coming up? One way we're staying present, focusing on our process, focusing on the next point. The other way, we're so wrapped up in, okay, am I going to win this match or am I going to lose this match? And what are the consequences of that? And I think, I know I've used this term other times recently, but I think it really is the default state for a lot of people. The default state is focusing on our results. The default state is sort of jumping ahead towards the future in terms of thinking about what could happen. And also, people will jump towards the past in different situations as well, based on scores, based on results, based on things like that. So I think, you know, it's about, we don't want to be judgmental of ourselves for doing it. It's very normal. I think it happens to everybody, but I think we want to recognize it and just also recognize, I think for for just about everybody, when we're at our best is not when we're so focused on what could happen or what might happen in the future. It's not when we're so focused on what's happened already. It's when we're present. It's when we're immersed in the moment. When people talk about that flow state, and it really is that immersion in the moment, right? It's when we can get into the zone in that sort of a way. And that happens when we're focused on the present and what we need to do right now rather than looking forwards or looking behind us.
And we talked about this before we started recording, Josh, how I had said this to a student earlier today that a tennis match is like an entire lifetime of adversity compressed into 90 plus minutes because you're dealing with pressure, you're dealing with maybe people watching you and judging you, you're dealing with the uncertainty of an outcome at the end. It's there's lots of losing that goes on. There's making of mistakes, and there's so much that happens that when we play tennis, can we use tennis as a teacher rather than something just to win? In essence, it's really training us not only to be better tennis players and to handle all these moments better, but so much of what we're experiencing on the court can translate into how you handle life in general. And I will often have that conversation with younger players when we're first talking about the mental game and what they can get out of this is, when you get a little bit older, maybe you're competing for a job, maybe you have to do a presentation, you're in a big job interview, your experience in a sport like tennis will just make you feel more prepared, make you feel more capable of handling some of these moments because you've had to deal with them multiple times in your past. And so I think with tennis being the way it is, we can look at it as I said, as a teacher. And if we look at your career overall, maybe to come back to this Marcus Aurelius quote, if we're trying to almost envision our entire tennis career as one thing, and some people may do this outside of tennis because we're often asked, all right, what's your goal in 5 years? Where do you want to be in 10 years? These things are very hard to answer. I've never been very good in answering those questions, Josh. I might have a high level purpose of I'd like to become maybe the best person I can become, but there's a certain level of I kind of need to see what happens and go along with that. Very much taking course corrections based on life. Life will throw different things at you. And so much of that's hard to predict. I read, recently, maybe within the last few years, how in business, they're getting away from like these multi-year plans and actually going to things that are more 90 to 120 days because that's the way business is today and how fast things are. That's how far they can forecast out accurately. When we had Kathy Uchschneider on and we shared her TED Talk in the show notes of that episode, she focuses a lot on 6-week goals. It's a nice short period of time, controllable. Things can be achievable there. We might still need to make some course corrections, but we're not experiencing our entire life at one point and feeling this need that it goes from A to B to C to D, and that's the way it must happen. And so, yeah, we can forecast out a little bit, but not too much. We want to know what can happen in a reasonable amount of time, but to know like where your tennis game is going to be in 5 years, I have no idea. Because you can look at certain players on UTR, and I'll look at I love that stats page. That's like the only part of UTR I like, where you can see the trend of where a player has come in the last year. And sometimes a player will be completely flat with their UTR. They'll be the exact same place they were last year right now. And then other times you'll see players go from, wherever they were to maybe 1.5 points, almost 2 points higher. And, and so that's somebody who looks like they're a real learner, that their process is working. But even that person, do we know that 2-point growth will go year after year after year? No, we don't know. Maybe.
And it can't at a certain
level, there will be diminishing returns.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
You'll hit something like the ceiling there. So I think when we think about the future so much in terms of trying to have it planned out, that can lead to a trap because now you're creating expectations. And we've discussed that word a gazillion times on this podcast, and there's really nothing good about that with expectations because now you're always judging the present moment about how you think it should have been rather than how it really is, and instead bringing us back to the present. So I think that's another take, Josh, on this particular quote is like not trying to plan stuff out so much that you can't be in the present and dealing with what's happening there and make course corrections.
Absolutely. To me, there's a couple different things that come to mind when you say that. To me, well, there's this concept of the butterfly effect, where we don't necessarily know what direction things, we don't necessarily know what direction things are gonna go in, and sometimes based on one decision that we make or one thing that happens, it ends up having a ripple effect and impacting all these different all these different areas. I can bring up one example from my personal life that my my sister-in-law got into a doctoral program in Boulder, Colorado, right around 2 years ago. And her and my brother ended up moving to Boulder, Colorado. And then my girlfriend and I ended up moving to Boulder, Colorado. And now my parents are talking about it as well. And this never would have happened without her getting into that doctoral program and starting that sort of ripple effect. So to me, I think one thing we can think about is that sort of effect, that butterfly effect, and how, just one decision, one instance like that can have all these different impacts going forward. But I think, yeah, to me, another thought that comes to mind is sort of this idea of that Eric Buderak talks about, where instead of having these huge goals for ourselves, I want to be number one in the world, I want to be the best tennis player who's ever lived. I think in certain ways those can be helpful and that I think that can be a really powerful vision for ourselves. But I think that can also have downsides. I think it can be in certain ways, we can focus on the distance that we have from where we are to where we want to be. And Eric Buderak talks, I mean, the name of his TED Talk, which I know we've referenced before, and if people haven't checked it out, I would, certainly encourage people to. I think it really is impactful, and I think people will definitely get a lot out of it. But he talks about, it's called Don't Dream Big. And the idea is, instead of focusing so much on maybe some big, lofty end goal that we have, can we focus on the next step? And can we lay out a plan? And can we really think about what we need to do to take that next step and make it realistic for ourselves? And then once we've made that next step, okay, great. Let's recognize it, celebrate it, and then let's focus on the next step. And then let's focus on the next one. And um, yeah, and he talks about, and yeah, I could have actually mixed up the name, but he talks about how by sort of what he refers to as almost like dreaming small and focusing on that next step, how actually that's what leads to growth over time, right? He was somebody that played Division 3 tennis, and most people that play at that level go on to have don't go on to be top 100 in the world ATP players in singles or doubles. But, he showed through sort of his system of not dreaming big and, taking it really, really focusing on that next step and having a clear game plan for that, each step. And he talks about, okay, that for, one of the steps was let's get that first point, that first ATP point, which took a while. Okay, now we got that point, and then it's okay, well, what comes next now? Okay, and then what comes next? And let's just be as focused as possible on what comes next, what we need to do to continue making progress. And I think that progress is really, can we try to get a little bit better? Can we try to get a little bit better? Can we try to be a bit more professional, a bit mentally tougher, a bit more technically sound with our game, have a bit better footwork? And can we focus on just taking that next step or being that 1% better. And if we can make that a habit, if that can be our system of consistently making those small improvements over time, yeah, if we can consistently make those small improvements, then over time the growth that we have is remarkable. I mean, go James Clear in his book Atomic Habits, he shows a graph where, it's a he he shows if we look at the difference between somebody that gets 1% better each day compared to that gets 1% worse each day. And just looking at it, and it's a math equation ultimately, where it's 1.01. So, 1.01 to the power of 365, with the idea that every day we're getting 1% better, and that's not just, 3.65 at the end of the year. But it ends up actually being 37.8 essentially, with the idea that that has a compounding effect. It's not just that we're looking at, it's not just that each day we're okay, we're 1% better than we were from the first day, and then the second day we're 2% better, and then 3% better, and 4% better. It all builds on itself. So if we can find ways to get a bit better each day, to me, that really is us staying present. That's us focusing on what we need to do right now, rather than getting so wrapped up in the future and how far we need to go in these big 5, 10 year plans like you were talking about, Brian. But more so doing whatever we need to do today to get a bit better and a bit closer to where we ultimately want to be.
So, one caveat on the 1% better: you cannot raise your level of play by 1% each day. That is not within your control. So, when we say that, it's more about, can you be 1% better at something you do control?
Yep.
Right? That could be your effort level. It could be your attitude. It could be in simply your discipline with your footwork. And so that's where the 1% better stuff has to be addressed, not to things like outcomes or even performance level. Those are more after effects of you getting 1% better at the controllable things. And I think, so we want to be clear, like your UTR is not going to improve by like 37% in a year because of you focused on 1% better, right? If you get 1% better at some of these things, you might get 37%. You might actually even get more level wise, or you might get less, but you won't generally get worse at that. I think the other thing with Eric Budarak, and he says this as an aside in the talk, he said, having big goals does work for some. That's true. Michael Phelps is a great example of that. And there's another video I show to players of Michael Phelps talking about his big goals. But you know what he has in common with Eric Budarak? Doing the daily work. For him, it was about, okay, what do I need to do today if this is my vision of who I want to be and what I want to achieve? For Eric, it's not that he didn't have a big goal, I don't think, Josh. I think he just wanted to see how good he could get. And that was the driving force. How good could I get? If he didn't have that, then I don't know that he has a true enough purpose to become what he became. And so whether the goal is to be a professional or win gold medals, the thing that always needs to be at the top is, how good can I get? That should be the sort of the foundational goal, right? The purpose. Other big, quote unquote, big goals like gold medals or winning Wimbledon or becoming a top 10 player, those are still below the foundational goal of how good can I get? So I think it's important to have that understanding as we go into it. I think Eric is correct in that many people do get overwhelmed with the big dream. And I think they get overwhelmed at times because they don't make the connection between the big dream and what do I need to do today. They just kind of do what they do, or they'll sign up for lessons at their local club, and they'll just kind of plug into an existing structure that isn't necessarily all about you realizing your potential. It's to sell court time, or make money as an academy or as a program. Yes, they of course want you to improve, but they're not necessarily 100% invested in you becoming the best you can become. That's just not a part of the model, and that's not the way it works. So we have to be more cognizant of that, and therefore design our days in ways like Michael Phelps did, in ways like Eric Buderak did, so that it's driving us toward that purpose of seeing how good we can get. And to me, when we think about goals, it's great to think about these, result-oriented goals or performance goals, but always know at the top that foundational goal has to be exploring how good I can get at the sport of tennis or whatever it is in life.
Absolutely. And if that's the goal, if that's the goal in terms of let's see how good I can get, I want to be the best player that I can be, then to me that takes a lot of pressure off. If our goal is very result focused, I want to be number one, the number one player in Eastern or in New England, or I want to be top 10 or number one in the world, or whatever it may be. Okay, I get that. And again, for some people that can be helpful, but I think that there are also factors out of your control. What if there's somebody else that also has that same goal and maybe has certain advantages, certain physical advantages, certain access to court time or to coaches or whatever it may be. So I think if we're focusing on controllable factors, which we want to do ultimately, us being the best player we can be and us going through a process where we're taking steps in that direction. And yeah, I totally agree, Brian, that us getting 1% better each day doesn't mean our tennis level is improving 1% each day. And by the end of a year, if we do that, then we're going to be 37 times better than we are right now. But that might mean that different aspects of our game can improve, right? Maybe one day it's, we're working on our kick serve. And okay, I've, really figured out something with my kick serve out there. Or maybe one day it's footwork that's the focus. Or maybe another day it's, is me really being intentional about slowing things down, taking that deliberate approach between points. So I think that we can have a different focus each day, a different area of improvement that we really are striving for. And I think having that deliberate practice and those specific goals or process goals going into practice makes it so much easier to make that type of progress on a particular day rather than us just, oh, I want to go out there and play well. I want to, I'm hoping for the best. I'm hoping I can play well out there today. Okay, that's great. I hope you can, but I think if you can go out there with specific goals about what you want to improve, it's so much easier to finish the end of the day feeling like, okay, I've done what I could out there to make myself a better player today. And that is one step towards me being the best player that I can be ultimately.
I know we're kind of getting into the goal setting piece, but I wanted to throw something out there that Christian Zepp, he's a great sports psychology professional in Germany, shared. He works with a lot of elite athletes, a lot of Olympic level athletes. And when he talks about goal setting, and this is more on the result or outcome side, he likes to use kind of ranges of goals, meaning that, what is sort of the minimum goal that you would like to achieve? And then, maybe what's the optimal? So we could say, Josh, like it could be a ranking. I want to be, in the top 5 in the world. That's my optimal goal. But what would be the minimal kind of acceptable goal? Maybe it's top 20. Or it could be on a tournament. Hey, I'd like to win this tournament, but would making the quarterfinals be an acceptable level of achievement there? And that way, it's not so much about, oh, I failed to reach my goal. It's understanding that there's so many things that are out of your control that we want to think in ranges between, right, what's the minimal kind of target that I want to have, but what's the optimal or the top piece? And if we're somewhere in the middle of that, great, awesome. Get the optimal goal, great. All right, but hey, here's the minimum. Well, I achieved that. That's good. I can build on that and go forward. Because one part of Eric's talk was very interesting. He mentioned a lot of people that were on the tour with him who had all these dreams of being top players and winning Grand Slams and participating, and it wasn't happening for them. And they were using those expectations of such goals to make themselves feel bad. Where Eric, who was just working day by day by day, if we go back to Marcus Aurelius, going along with that, right? Just being in the present moment, he felt like he was making it every single day. He did not have, it wasn't making himself feel bad for where he was. In fact, he was really happy and satisfied with how far he had come. So in essence, he was in a better position to handle what was going to come next than someone who was more or less saddled emotionally by what had happened or not happened in the past. And so I think, if we kind of come back and look to wrap up this topic with this quote, it's really all about understanding your past, understanding what you want in the future, and then taking that information to make the right steps in the present and working on those little daily things that will make you better. And just letting that kind of add up. You mentioned the kind of the compound piece of this, Josh, right? Forget about the numbers. Just like you doing things consistently day after day after day, that's going to add up into something where you will have changed as a person when you look out 3 or 6 months. You may not notice the difference tomorrow, but 6 months from now, you'll be a vastly different person and most likely a better tennis player, a better person as well.
Absolutely. And I think that's a good way to put it. And I think, yeah, I sometimes see with certain athletes that I work with, I'll recommend using a particular tool. Maybe it's meditation, maybe it's visualization, different types of things. And sometimes the impact of it isn't seen right away. And I think that can sometimes feel discouraging. It's like, oh, well, why am I doing this? Right. And I think, I think there's different pieces there. I think first of all, we can recognize that, that there's research about it. We can recognize that other people have benefited from it, including top professional athletes. But I think it's also, can we be patient? Can we be patient enough to let those effects take place? Right. We talk about 3 or 6 months. If we try something once or twice and then we throw it away and we decide we're not gonna, this isn't for us, then we never really give ourselves the chance to experience those impacts.
Yeah, 100%. So, good conversation today. Good Marcus Aurelius and Stoicism stuff. Well, that's our show for today. Thank you all for listening. For more on today's episode, please check out the show notes. If you have any feedback or questions for me and Josh, please email us at tennisiqpodcast@gmail.com. Also, if you're enjoying the content that Josh and I discuss on the show, please rate and review the podcast so other tennis enthusiasts can find it more easily. Additionally, to be notified of new episodes, please subscribe to the show on your podcast platform of choice, including YouTube. And you can also check us out on Instagram. If you would like to support the podcast, please visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/tennisiqpodcast/membership, where you can learn about the benefits of being part of the Tennis IQ podcast community. Thanks again, and we'll talk to you soon in our next episode.